Elk Run, Maryland, June 1994. A 24-year-old kindergarten aide leaves a church picnic just after dusk, tells a friend she'll see her Monday, and disappears somewhere in the half-mile between the fellowship hall and her apartment above the hardware store. It takes 32 years, a genetic database that didn't exist when she was born, and one man the whole town had spent 3 decades calling a pillar of the community to finally close the file. When the arrest came, in the spring of 2026, it didn't come for a drifter or a stranger passing through on Route 40. It came for the town pharmacist, the man who filled half of Elk Run's prescriptions, the man who ran the youth mentorship program out of the church basement, the man whose photograph hung in the volunteer fire hall for 20 years of service. This is the story of how a single hair, sealed in a paper evidence envelope since the Clinton administration, finally spoke. Elk Run sits in the flat farm country of Maryland's Eastern Shore, a town of just under 2,200 people, built around a grain elevator and a 2-block main street that still has a working soda fountain. In 1994, it was the kind of place where the biggest local controversy was whether the county would repave Route 213 before harvest. Melissa Caro had grown up there, moved away for 2 years of community college in Salisbury, and come back that spring to take a job as an aide in the kindergarten classroom at Elk Run Elementary, the same classroom she'd sat in herself at age 5. She rented a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of place where you could hear the bell over the shop door 2 floors down. Her mother worked the counter at the pharmacy 3 doors up, which meant Melissa was in and out of that pharmacy most weeks of her life, chatting with the pharmacist behind the counter, the way you talk to someone who's filled your family's prescriptions since before you could read. The town smelled like cut hay that June, the fields on either side of the highway gold and heavy, the evenings warm enough that the whole church picnic spilled out onto the lawn behind the fellowship hall until well past 9. People in Elk Run still describe that summer as the last one that felt entirely safe. After Melissa, nobody in town ever quite let their kids walk home alone again. The picnic broke up a little after 9:30 on the evening of June 11, 1994, a Saturday. Melissa stayed to help fold tables, said goodnight to the last few volunteers at 9:45, and set off walking the half-mile back to her apartment, a route she'd walked 100 times, past the grain elevator, past the volunteer fire hall, down Main Street to the hardware store. She never arrived. Her mother, expecting a call that never came, drove the route herself just before midnight and found nothing. By 1 in the morning, half the volunteer fire department was combing the ditches along the road with flashlights. The search went on for 4 days. On June 15th, a farmer checking an irrigation line found her in a drainage culvert less than a quarter mile off Route 213, barely visible from the road. She had been strangled. The medical examiner placed her death within 2 hours of leaving the picnic. Whoever did this had not taken her far. The Elk Run Police Department, a force of 9 officers in a town that size, was working past anything it had handled before. A young officer named Curtis Boyle, 29 at the time and only 2 years into the job, was assigned as lead investigator, a role he'd occupy for the rest of his career even after promotion to chief. Detectives from the county sheriff's office assisted, running down over 150 interviews by the end of that first summer. Investigators recovered hair and fiber evidence from Melissa's clothing, and a single hair not matching her own was preserved in the case file, catalogued and sealed, waiting on forensic tools that simply did not exist yet in 1994. They pursued a transient reported near the grain elevator that week. They looked hard at a former boyfriend, cleared by an alibi within days. They questioned a delivery driver twice, both times without enough to hold him. Boyle would later say the case never left him, that he drove past the culvert on Route 213 for 30 years and always slowed down without meaning to. Officially, the case stayed open. Practically, it went quiet by 1997. The file moved to a records room, revisited every few years when a new detective got assigned cold cases and worked through the box out of duty more than hope. The years did to Elk Run what cold years always do to a small town. Melissa's mother kept working the pharmacy counter for another 11 years, retiring in 2005, still asking Chief Boyle for updates every time she saw him at the grocery store. Her father died in 2011 without an answer. Her younger sister, Dana, 12 years old the summer it happened, grew up, stayed in town, and eventually took over her mother's old volunteer shift at the church. The same fellowship hall where Melissa had folded tables on her last night. Dana kept a photograph of her sister from that picnic, the last one ever taken of her, tucked into a kitchen drawer for over 3 decades. Boyle, promoted to chief in 2009, kept a photocopy of the case file in his own desk long after the department's official copy went into storage. Twice a year, he called the state crime lab to ask if anything had changed with the Dina sample. For a long time, nothing had. The hair sat catalogued in a sealed envelope, waiting for a kind of forensic science that in 1994 hadn't been invented yet, and in 2011 still couldn't reach far enough. That changed in late 2025, when Maryland's Cold Case Unit, working through a state-funded backlog initiative, sent the 31-year-old hair sample to a forensic genetic genealogy lab for a fresh workup, using techniques that had matured considerably in the years since the sample was first collected. Analysts extracted a usable profile and uploaded it to a genealogy database that by 2026 held tens of millions of consumer DNA profiles, far larger than anything available even 5 years earlier. Within a month they had a lead, not a direct match, but a second cousin, a woman in Delaware who had taken a home ancestry test purely out of curiosity and had no idea her results had just handed investigators the first real thread in the case in 3 decades. Genealogists spent the following weeks reconstructing the family tree by hand, marriage licenses, obituaries, church records, narrowing dozens of possible relatives down to a small number of men who had lived in or near Elk Run in 1994. One name matched every filter. A man still living in the same house on Cedar Street he'd occupied for 40 years. A man who had in fact been interviewed briefly by investigators back in 1994. One short conversation, never followed up on, because at the time there was no reason in the world to suspect him. Investigators requested a covert DNA sample rather than tip him off with a warrant. In February 2026, a detective followed the man to the diner, where he ate breakfast most mornings, and collected a discarded coffee cup after he left. The lab match came back within 2 weeks. Not a familial probability, a direct match to the 31-year-old hair. The man's name was Richard Colby, 68 years old, the town's pharmacist for over 30 years, and for 2 decades, the volunteer fire department's longtime treasurer. He had run the youth mentorship program out of the Lutheran church basement for 15 years. He had filled Melissa Caro's mother's prescriptions for a decade before the murder and continued filling them for 11 years afterward, ringing her up at the counter, asking about Dana, never once giving anyone reason to look twice. When Chief Boyle, 61 years old by then and still leading the department, arrived at the pharmacy with a warrant on a Tuesday morning in March 2026, Colby was behind the counter in his white coat. He asked if he could finish with the customer in front of him first. He could not. He was walked out through the front door of the pharmacy in handcuffs, past the same shelves where he'd sold cough syrup and aspirin to 3 generations of Elk Run families, in full view of a line of customers who would later describe the moment as the single strangest thing they had ever witnessed in their lives. The arrest tore through Elk Run in a way nothing had since the murder itself. Longtime residents spoke of a grief that had almost nothing to do with losing him, and everything to do with the retroactive horror of every ordinary interaction they now had to relive with new eyes. Former mentorship kids, now grown, gave interviews describing a man who had taught them to fish, who covered prescription costs for families who couldn't pay, who never so much as raised his voice at anyone. That was the part nobody in town could get past. There had never been a warning sign, because he had never given one. Investigators, reconstructing his 1994 alibi 3 decades later, found it had never been formally verified at all, simply accepted. The way a badge or a pharmacist's coat or 30 years of quiet good standing tends to buy a man the benefit of the doubt nobody thinks to question. Colby was charged with first-degree murder in April 2026. He pled not guilty. The trial that followed that fall lasted 9 days. The preserved hair evidence, the genealogy trail, and the coffee cup match formed the spine of the prosecution's case. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without parole. He was 69 years old. Dana Caro was 44 the day she watched the verdict read aloud from the second row of the courtroom. The same photograph from the picnic still tucked in her kitchen drawer 32 years later. She said afterward that what she felt wasn't triumph. It was a kind of exhaustion that reached all the way down. The particular tiredness of a question finally closing after a lifetime of carrying it open. Chief Curtis Boyle, 61, watched the sentencing from the gallery too. The case he had never let go of finally, formally, closed after 32 years. Melissa Caro would have turned 56 that fall. Her photograph sits on Dana's kitchen windowsill now, the same one from the church picnic. A 24-year-old woman laughing mid-sentence, caught by someone's camera on an ordinary Saturday evening in June, long before anyone in Elk Run understood what that ordinary evening was about to cost them. What finally closed her case wasn't a confession or a witness whose conscience broke after decades of silence. It was a single strand of hair, sealed in an envelope since before some of the detectives who found it were even born, patient enough to wait 31 years for a database to finally learn its name. Elk Run has spent the months since rebuilding a kind of trust that may never fully return to what it was on June 10, 1994. The last ordinary day before everything changed. If there's a lesson in what happened here, it's one small towns keep learning the hard way. The man behind the counter for 30 years is not automatically the man you think he is. And the truth, however long it takes, keeps its own schedule.